Welcome to Breakpoint this week. I'm Shane Morris, and I'm here with John Stonestreet talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, I want to share a little factoid with you here. Did you know that this is the most senior presidential contest in American history? We're coming up right now on as we record this, on Joe Biden's acceptance speech at the remote Democratic National Convention for the presidency. And no matter who wins, unless I'm mistaken here, this will be the oldest president in U.S. history.
You sound like you're expressing some millennial bitterness here. Is this like an boomer moment? Okay, boomer moment for you?
I really am. You know, millennials have endured something that no other generation has, which is the pinnacle of the extension of life expectancy. So boomers have basically lived longer than any other generation in history.
And you guys are like, get out of the way and let us lead.
On some level, it feels like that. I just think it's ironic, and this has been noted.
Should I take that personally? I'm not a boomer. I'm an Xer. I live in the middle.
You're a Gen X. Nobody cares about Gen X. Nobody
cares about Gen X, including Gen Xers.
Right, exactly. I just think it's interesting, John, given all the emphasis that we've seen on, and we'll talk about the convention here in a second, but on the fresh blood, the fresh faces, the new up and coming millennial power brokers, and yet we still have this extremely old, extremely white top of each ticket for president from both parties. I just found that intriguing. I'm not sure how to cash it out exactly, what the implications are, but wow.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, it's also interesting to ask. And over at the National Review podcast, the editors, they were wrestling with, if you look at who's got the youngest farm team, in other words, which party is ready to has the youngest crop of leaders ready to step up and lead. And right. I think that would be a difference of perspective. They actually said the Republicans, when you had folks like Josh Hawley and who's the guy from James Langford and some others, not to mention Marco Rubio.
Oh, yeah,
and
Marco
some others.
Rubio for sure.
But, AOC got a quick stage time, which is something else we need to talk about too. Like, what do you think about the virtual convention? It's interesting because in 2016, Bernie Sanders supporters spent a good bit of time interrupting the first several days of the convention. There's this kind of fluid, organic nature to political conventions where if you've got some really grumpy people, they're going to start a chant, or they're going to jump in, or they're going to create some sort of energy. And there's a whole lot of, networking and things like that going on behind the scenes. And none of that is happening at either convention, either the Republican or the Democratic this year. A lot of people have talked about that it's just boring. I don't know if that's avoidable. I think, if, the Republicans are also going to struggle. How do you keep people kind of tuned into this when there's not all the noise and the hype going on behind the scenes? So do you think this is going to be a more effective or less effective convention? And I guess the other question is, what is the actual effect of a convention? Like, what does it actually accomplish anyway? I was going to ask that.
What on earth is a convention exactly supposed to accomplish other than, hype up the party's base and have a lot of fanfare around the candidates? I was going to say,
well, certain conventions certainly have served to unify, right? Certain conventions have certainly, you walk into, last year in the Democratic National Convention, there was real question. I keep saying last year because it feels like last year. 2016 at the Democratic National Convention, there was still not, there wasn't like everybody was on board. Republicans really were no different. There was still people that had to be kind of brought on board, and the convention has often served that way.
Oh man, I still take my my Barry Goldwater pin to every Republican event I attend.
Oh wow, I'm glad you have one, but that's way before you were even born, wasn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, that
yeah, you got to admit that. I think the convention also serves to kind of coronate the next generation. We definitely saw that with Barack Obama,
right?
And what would that have been? 2004, right? Because he was elected in 2008.
That was when his big speech was, and everyone said, "Ooh, yeah, he's an up and comer." And then next thing you know, he's at the top of the ticket.
For the record, I said to a number of colleagues and friends and political observers, he's the next nominee for president. And they all said, no way, too young, too inexperienced. But I watched that speech that he gave in 2004, and he lit the place up. And I thought, this is the next nominee. For the record, I predicted it. But also for the record, I
How'd you do
got
on
2016.
2016?
That one doesn't count.
I was going to ask
That
that.
one doesn't count.
Well, so what do you think about Joe Biden, John? As we're recording this, it's a little bit before his speech here where he accepts the nomination at the Democratic convention. What do you think of Joe Biden as a candidate here? And we can't get too political on this program, but I think there are a whole lot of interesting, worldview and social implications that we can bring out from this developing race here, even as it's held in a remote online convention.
Yeah, I think that the bigger question, because we're supposed to stay biblical worldview,
Right.
not necessarily political, which we're already struggling to do clearly from today's program. But we talked about the leftward direction of the Democratic ticket last week. We're going to talk about some of the issues on the Republican side, I think, this week. And on Monday's podcast, for example, I'm interviewing a guy who's collected and put forth kind of the best case for why what's happening in Nigeria should be called genocide. And we have a president and a vice president who actually promised to help Christian refugees and has not. And that's one of the failed promises of this president. Although he's kept a lot of pro-life ones, religious liberty ones, this is not one that he's come through on. But I think maybe a different question is not to just aim it at Joe Biden. I mean, I've got all kinds of thoughts about that, obviously. Are we putting too much stock in politics as Americans? The lingo, the life and death lingo. I was listening to a left-leaning podcast earlier this week where one of the commentators talked about how Donald Trump had ruined her day-to-day life. And I'm thinking, really? Is that really what's happened? He's ruined our day-to-day lives? I don't even know what that could possibly mean, unless you live somewhere near where the security detail causes you a bunch of problems.
Yeah, I remember that same kind of attitude on the right when Barack Obama was elected president, where you had these predictions, not only that the America as we know it would sort of be destroyed by his election, but also just day to day people living in misery because of the policy choices that were being made and the views that were being expressed from the White House. And I just said, really, I'm having the best at that time 4 years of my life. I got married, or at least I met my wife at that point. I got married in the second term. I got my current job and I finished college. It was a really great time for me. And there's got to be a separation there, right? Between
there's got to be a realization there's got to be a realization that elections do matter. Politics do matter. I mean, we remember the last term of President Obama and the difference that it made for educators and international policy and the advancement of abortion rights and forcing nuns to buy birth control, right? And we know that there's policy, changes and realities that matter under this presidency. My point is that this kind of there's got to be some way we can land on. I take responsibility as a Christian citizen to care about who our leaders are. I pray for our leaders. I pray for good leaders, as Osguinness reminded us of this past week during our prayer call. And then I also remember that the most important relationships that I have are not political ones. They're my family. In fact, the family relationships that we have are political relationships. What's happening for us to learn to govern ourselves and for us to teach our children to govern themselves is going to have so much more importance in the long run, even politically speaking, even if we weren't bringing in quality of life and financial health and, spiritual connection with God. Even on a political level, the political problems that we are seeing are actually failures of civil society more than they're failures of the White House, one direction or another. And, it's that rhetoric that I think, too many conservatives are being worked up right now during the DNC. Too many, Democrats will be worked up during the RNC and every other time anything happens. And I think we have to, as Christians, remember what matters most. It's something that Chuck called the political illusion, and it's ever a temptation.
Yeah, what helps me, John, is to navigate that tension. On the one hand, let me describe the tension first. On the one hand, what we said is true, that you can live your life faithfully, joyfully, no matter what's going on in politics. And the early Christians did that too. The policies of the Roman Empire were a good deal more atrocious than the policies of the worst policies that we bemoan in the United States right now. But the other side of the coin is that, we really do have two divergent views of what it means to be human at work right now in politics. And that's something that really hasn't been true in past generations. We're asking questions like, what is life? What is family? What are rights? What's the purpose of the government? What is violence even? Can speech be violence? And all these, all these questions are floating around, and they become very existential. Like it feels as if we lose this election, whoever we is, then it's going to be the end of the world. And that's that existential panic you see on both sides. And eventually that could lead to, as we discussed in a previous program, that could lead to just a breakup of the whole process. So the way I navigate it, I think, John, is really to remember that we have a duty as Christians to simply do the next thing that is faithful. So obey God with what we've been given. I love what, not to get too nerdy here, but I love what, Gandalf tells Frodo in The Lord of the Rings, that all we have to decide is what to do with the time that's given us. And then it doesn't matter how bad the times are, as long as we make the right choice and are faithful. As Chuck said, it doesn't matter if we're successful by the world's standards. We just be faithful with what we're given. And that's our task in this time when politics is bringing to bear so many divergent and even incompatible views of life.
Well, my political predictions for 2020 is not who's going to win, because I have no idea, and it could all change.
Yeah, me neither.
My political predictions are that that we're going to put too much attention on it, that we're not the kind of society that can actually handle losing right now, and that's actually very worrisome. And that the most important things that we can do is take care of our own territory. I think there's going to be a lot of regret too. I've just watched some good friends over the last 4 years lose their friendship.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to look back at this and say, yeah, this stuff mattered, but I wish I hadn't done this. I wish I hadn't burned the house down over here. I wish I wouldn't have just, ruined this relationship and burned those bridges. And I've spent a lot of time over the last week thinking about the regrets we're going to have looking back during this time. And I think a lot of it is going to have to do with just kind of misunderstanding the moment. And I get it. I suspect we're going to see a lot of things after the election that are going to make us even more concerned about the future of our nation, the stability. I'm not saying there's going to be a civil war, anything like that. We've seen those predictions, but I tell you what, there's going to be some extreme responses either way that it goes, that is going to tell us a lot more about ourselves than about the results of the election.
Well, folks, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. We're back on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, another story that emerged just about 24 hours before we recorded this happened at a press conference with President Trump, where a reporter asked him what he thinks about the conspiracy theory complex known as QAnon. And this was the first time the president had been asked about this publicly. And he came back by basically saying, I don't know a whole lot about it, but I hear that they really like me and that they're patriots. They love this country. So good for them on that. And that really marked the moment, I think, when QAnon became a national story, because we've seen a few mainstream news stories about this conspiracy theory before, but now the president of the United States has given his at least some hint of a word on the matter, and it's time to talk about it. So in particular, I think, and a former co-host on this show, Ed Stetzer, has written a lot, as well as Joe Carter over the Gospel Coalition, about QAnon's inroads that it's making into churches, into the evangelical community, and how many Christians are sort of falling for this conspiracy theory. So let's talk about this, because it's I think an opportunity to talk about the broader issue of conspiratorial thinking that's taking root in the American mind, but especially in the church.
Yeah, it was hard to know what the president was thinking when he responded. I don't know if I'd mark it as kind of the mainstreaming of this. That QAnon has gotten a lot of headlines, particularly over the last 2 or 3 weeks. And I think part of it has to do with just the fact that we're online so much more than we were, even just yesterday. Yeah. So because of being at home and so on, and a lot of that has kind of driven traffic to different places. And I've seen some interesting studies on that. And I'm still not sure whether, QAnon is as important as media is making it out to be. I do know that it's it's wrong. It's a conspiracy theory, and it's
For
one that
those who don't know, it basically is the idea that a ring of powerful pedophiles is running the world
running
and
the
trying
world.
to
Yeah.
consolidate power under a one world government.
Folks might remember Pizzagate and things like
Right.
that and so on. Well, and I've been asked a lot over during COVID about various conspiracy theories, because QAnon's not the only one. There's all kinds of them that are out there. Americans, by the way, are uniquely somehow susceptible, it seems. There's a sense of individualism. There's a distrust of authority that just kind of runs deep
Come to
in
America. We have
America.
cults and conspiracy theories.
Well, we really do. And I actually think the cult conversation is a really helpful one. So what I'm way more interested in is how do we know a conspiracy theory is a conspiracy theory? I think there's also questions about what is it about America? What is it about evangelicals in America that make us susceptible to this? And I think we're more susceptible than we want to admit.
Right.
About this. And it has to do with, I think, being driven by a fear of the position that we're in culturally, kind of the lost ground that we have. Of course, a lot of people end up connecting some conspiratorial beliefs about all kinds of different things that they buy into with the larger eschatology, what they think about the end times. I'm not sure what's the chicken and what's the egg on that one, for the record. I mean, I think that there's it's kind of a perfect storm that creates some of these things. But years ago, in recognizing cults, and I kind of thought, this is helpful. Maybe we can come up with something that applies to this. A good friend of mine from early days at Summit Ministries, a guy named Kevin Bywater, talked about how you can recognize a cult. And he gave us an add, subtract, multiply, and divide sort of framework.
It's like a scorecard.
Well, yeah, a cult adds to the scriptures. There's some other supernatural revelation. A cult subtracts from the deity or exclusivity of Christ. A cult multiplies the requirements of salvation, and a cult divides the body of Christ. And you look at that and you say, well, yeah, that kind of sums it up, right? I mean, you can kind of say that's a commonality. And I think that, at least when we're talking about conspiracy, is that oftentimes conspiracy theories are they flourish because of fear. Right. And they flourish not because of fear of God, but because fear of man. And I think that's one thing that we see. Secondly, it still roots, and I think so many things in where we miss a Christian worldview is rooted in our inability to really nail down the fall. It's always somebody else's fault with the world. No, look. The fact of the matter is, throughout history, there were bad people who did bad things, and the bad things they did led to enormous destruction. And we can look at Hitler and Pol Pot and Genghis Khan, and the list goes on and on and on. But the idea that we're the good guys and they're the bad guys is actually where this thing really breaks down. And I don't know how many times in the last 3 months I can quote Alexander Solzhenitsyn, but I'll do it again. The line of good and evil runs right down the middle of the human heart. So I think those are two things about kind of what we see. I think there's also a conflation when Christians buy into conspiracy theories between Christian causes and some other cause, whether it's
right.
The cause of America. The kingdom is confused at some level. And this is not to say that Christians don't care about America or shouldn't care about America, that we shouldn't celebrate the good things and steward the wonderful things and not lose and fight off the enemies, and especially the enemy ideas. Of course we should do all that, but it's the conflation of the two, I think, that sometimes leads to our unique susceptibility to conspiracy theories. And I think it's time we have a kind of a good look at ourselves. Like, why are these things flourishing? Why are we so quick to share an article on Facebook or on social media of some kind when it's saying something that we literally don't know to be true and maybe can't know to be true, but it agrees with us politically? That just shows that we're kind of rooted in a different cause.
We're going to talk about this on Breakpoint in the coming week sometime. But one of the points I think we're going to make there and just highlight is that conspiracy theories prey on our desire for a very simple black and white view of the world. And the problem is with Solzhenitsyn's and Christianity's view of the fall, we don't have a very simple black and white view of the world, because everyone has this problem we call sin. And so you can't sort of put the white hats and the black hats on people and say, well, it's this group of shadowy bad guys over here who have messed up the world, and they're the explanation, they're the agency behind all the bad things that I don't like, and the fact that I've lost, my religion has lost cultural cachet, and I no longer feel at home in this place. It's a way of explaining a sense of disorientation that that evangelicals in particular, but just in general, traditionally minded people have in this country. And you'll see people take it out on other things like immigration, for instance. But by and large, I think the impulse is to explain away very simply the things you don't like about the world, the things that are going wrong in the world, and making you feel alienated. And then it's, even though you don't think you can fight them, even though in many conspiracy theories, the bad actors are so cosmic feeling, supernatural. It's almost like something out of a movie, that you couldn't possibly have any hope of fighting them or opposing them. It does feel good to have that sweet inside knowledge that, well, I at least understand what's going on. I haven't, there's a reason why conspiracy theorists are sort of stereotypically known for saying, wake up, you've got the wool pulled over your eyes, sheeple, because there's something sweet about being in the inner circle, as Lewis called it, the being in the know, having that gnosis, as early heretics, against Christianity would have had it. So that's my psychoanalysis for where it's coming from exactly. QAnon and other related conspiracy theories are most dangerous in my mind because of that conflation, John, where they take Christianity and they use a bunch of Christian language and they pull you off in this direction that sort of sounds like spiritual warfare. And, it's against evil things like abuse of children. And then we just sort of accept that that's going on, and that becomes our new mission. And it rapidly actually begins to take on a fall, a spiritual conflict, an atonement, and a sort of restoration, resurrection narrative that becomes very quickly a replacement for the actual gospel. And people get obsessed with it. There was a great article in World by Emily Bells, and one of the things she highlights is how churches or pastors are complaining that church members are sort of picking and choosing Christianity in terms of how well it fits with conspiracy theories, and how they can use it in the service of those theories in order to play into that story. And that's
that's the story of worldview, and that's why I think worldview is such a helpful framework here, either in this framework or either talking about this or talking about almost anything else, because we also have Christians who try to squeeze their Christianity into consumerism, right? In other words, what best serves that? Or Christianity that tries to squeeze its Christians who try to squeeze their Christianity into socialism or into leftism or, any sort of framework. And when I've been asked, and I've been asked a lot about various conspiracy theories, particularly around COVID over the last couple weeks, and all this sort of thing. And there's a lot of them, swirling around there. And there's a perfect storm here of, we don't have any idea still what's happened with COVID exactly and what it exactly is and what kind of the infection is going to be going
We've all
forward.
got a lot of time on our hands with computers.
And we have spent a lot of time thinking about, we've had some moving targets, some irresponsible things said by leaders, plenty of irresponsible things said by leaders. And so the question is, the question has to do with, doesn't this conspiracy explain all of these things? And I'm like, yeah, but worldview explains all these things. In other words, in a crisis, when we don't know what's going on, we will punt back to our worldview to explain what's going on. And so, if you're already a governor or a mayor who thinks Christians are kind of in the way of government and that government really is the one that's going to serve to answer your questions and your problem, well, you're going to use these sort of opportunities and you're going to do really bizarre things like say, gatherings at churches over 50 have to be closed for the next year. And you're going to say that back in April. Or you're going to say things like this. And you're going to say, yeah, you can go gamble in casinos, but you can't meet in churches, right? I mean, you're just this sort of gut level worldview reaction. That's what a worldview is. And I think what we're seeing is, and I haven't talked with Kevin Bywater for years, but I'm going to quote him twice. He actually used the phrase once that many Christians, instead of having a worldview, have a WHIRLED view, a world view, like world together. Like you take a little bit of this and a little bit of that and blend it all together. You see what I did there?
I see. It was very clever.
It is very clever, but it's actually very, very helpful. And I think that's what that's what you see in conspiracy theories. You see a little bit of a different view of the fall, or a little bit of a different view of the human condition, or a little bit of a different story of redemption going forward. And then it gets kind of blessed with Christian categories. But we'll have more to say about this as we go forward.
I like that. We're going to take another quick break. We'll be right back after this to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. We're back here on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, there's one more headline I want to hit this week, and it was just so disturbing. It hit me right before, probably a couple hours before we sat down to record this. It's a Netflix movie that's actually from a French production company, so the whole thing is in French. And they put out a trailer late this week for this movie. It's about, in brief, a young 11-year-old Muslim girl who encounters this dancing group of young girls and who defies her parents' traditions and wishes to join it. Now, the original description for this program highlighted the fact that this is a twerking group. And if you watch the trailer, I do not recommend watching the trailer, by the way, but if you watch it and you're a parent of little girls, you're going to be outraged by this. You're going to be furious because it is blatant sexualization of children, going to be available on Netflix in just a couple of weeks here, I think. So there's a massive backlash happening against this. The comments were just incredibly furious. The video was disliked something like 66,000 times in the first 24 hours. So it looks like we're seeing the mainstreaming of pedophilia or sexualization of children on Netflix.
There's so much to say about this. First, there's also, and I didn't watch the trailer, but as I read a little bit about it, it seems like there's an undercurrent of, kind of the stiff, sexually repressive religion, in this case, Islam, being freed up by, the sexualization of a young girl. But just the images, it's just, this is just
the images are borderline child porn.
They're just going to feed the worst imaginations for folks. The inconsistency here, though, is what we need to talk about, Shane, which is, this is coming the same year as we have uncovered finally the longstanding abuse of at least teenage girls from Jeffrey Epstein. Right. And the entire world agrees that he was awful and that he did awful things to people. And now his assistant is, being held on the same sort of account. And then we have this. This is, the in the middle of the hashtag Me Too movement. But these are the inconsistencies that are all across the board. This is, a Democratic Party claiming to be all about hashtag Me Too and still having Bill Clinton speak on stage. This is Christians saying, at the DNC, this is Christians saying that character matters with a candidate like Bill Clinton, but doesn't matter with a candidate on our side like Donald Trump. This is the inconsistency of celebrating Hugh Hefner as one of the great liberators of women at all time when he died, and then 3 weeks later launching the Me Too movement because of Harvey Weinstein. This is the celebrities who called Harvey Weinstein out while riding his coattails to success for years and years and years. This is just one thing after another, after another, after another. And it's the reckoning. When a culture has this sort of broken down understanding of sexuality like we do, this is the reckoning that we have to go through, and it is messy and it is awful. I think the protests are going to win on this one, Shane. I think Netflix is going to be called on this hypocrisy and this advancement of the sexualization of children, and they're going to be forced to take it down. I think that's what's going to happen. The outrage on this is literally across the board. But you know what else happened this week? Or it's not this week, but 2 weeks ago? The number one pop song in America is the most sexually explicit, perverse thing that I have ever seen. And I haven't seen it. I'm just talking about reading through the lyrics and having to turn it off because of that. Just seeing the outrage and going, what's all this about? and it's an acronym. But that's supposed to empower women in an age of Me Too. You can't put this math together, Shane. It makes no sense. And that's what happens. This reckoning will have to continue to work itself out. And I also say this, last thing. We've said this over and over and over. The sexual revolution has always lied and said, the kids will be fine. The kids will be fine. Women and children have always been the victims of the sexual revolution. And here you have this film in which women, children, child women, little girls are the victims of the sexual revolution.
I'd note also, based on our earlier segment, John, that this is the sort of thing people see that gives plausibility to conspiracy theories like QAnon.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Because this is
that's
it
a
looks
great
like
point.
these are the big elites in our society, right? The execs at Netflix, directors in Hollywood, socialites like or financiers like Jeffrey Epstein, and socialites like his assistant who's now in jail. These people were running actual pedophilia rings. I mean, and now we have movies promoting pedophilia and sexualizing young girls. We had the movie a couple of years ago, Call Me by Your Name, which was essentially a promotion of pederasty. It gives great plausibility to these theories that the world is really run by a circle of elite pedophiles. And I'll just note too that when I posted this story, Neil Shenvi, who is an expert on critical theory, who we had on the Breakpoint podcast a while back, he commented on it, and he said that he actually quoted a book by an LGBT academic who was sort of wrestling with the question in a very morally neutral way of when exactly children can and should be sexualized, and whether we have to overcome the stigma of age. And this academic treated age in exactly the same way as, and I actually equated it to sex and race and gender and that kind of stuff, as if it's the same category. So given the point I'm making here is not that everyone who embraces a progressive view of sex is inevitably going to become a pedophile. What I'm saying is that when you embrace just what you said earlier, when you embrace certain premises, the conclusions work themselves out inevitably. And the most you can hope to do at that point is be inconsistent and just sort of say, yeah, I'm not going to go that far. But many people are consistent. Many people do go that far. And that's the cost of the sexual revolution. That's why the outrage we see today may not always be there to shut down products like this.
That's why the image of God has to be understood and believed and catechized. Because listen, if you think that all this conversation about sexuality in our culture is simply about morality, you're missing it. The conversation the culture is having is one about identity. We're telling kids how to behave, and the sexual revolution has reframed who they are. I've often wondered, we've had this kind of, slippery slope argument that this is going to lead to this is going to lead to this, and this is going to lead to pedophilia, right? That's the end of the slippery slope. And you go, well, how can it ever get there? Well, here's how it gets there. The only two criteria now for making sexual decisions that students are taught from the moment they enter our culture, only two. There's only two left. One is consent. And if an 18-year-old can consent, why can't a 17-year-old, and why can't a 16-year-old? That's a fuzzy category. That's the only, that's one of them. And the other one is self-actualization. Is it such a huge jump if we tell a 7-year-old they can determine who they are sexually, that we can't tell them how to behave sexually? And that's the lie that our culture is flipping through. This is, if they can say, oh, I'm not this gender on this gender, despite what my body part says, who are you to say then that they can't also get consent on what they do with those body parts? So this is literally how it happens. And I appreciate what you just said too about this feeds those conspiracy theories. The media, who cover, this really perverse song as an act of women's empowerment, right? And completely misheadline that and talk about like the real problem are people who think that it's, who don't want women to have their own sexuality or whatever bizarre thing, gets said. That feeds this stuff. And if you feel like you can't trust anyone and you spend too much time kind of digging deep into the recesses of the internet, someone kind of connects these dots, it can be very believable. So I appreciate you saying that. We've got to go back to a Christian worldview. We got to go back to what we know to be true about what it means to be human, who God is, how God relates to his creation, how God relates to his image bearers, what's wrong with the world, how is it fixed? And that's got to be our ultimate loyalties. Do not try to squish your Christianity into a conspiracy theory. Take those facts, run them through a Christian worldview. That's what we got to do.
Amen. For those of you favored members of the audience who are listening to the podcast version of Breakpoint this week, it's now time for our weekly recommendation session. And John, I've got one this week that has to do with a short course. Is it a short course, or is it just a presentation that we're going to have soon here at the Colson Center about making the case for life? And I want to strongly recommend a book by the speaker we're going to be having. His name is Scott Klusendorf. The first time I met Scott was at the Focus on the Family Institute when I was fresh out of high school. I went there to Colorado for a summer semester, and he came in and gave us this presentation on how to make the case for life in a succinct and powerful way in just a couple of minutes. And his point in that talk, and then in this book, which goes into more detail, it's called The Case for Life, is that the question of abortion really boils down to one question, which is, what is the unborn? And oftentimes I think we get really confused. When I was in youth and government program at the YMCA, we would go to the national conference, and me and this other group of young high school Christians would frequently find ourselves addled and confused by all the pro-choice kids who would say, well, what about, in cases of rape and incest? And what about the life of the mother? And what if she can't afford a baby? And what if there's deformities? And what if, and what if, and what if, and what if? And by the end of the conversation, we were just so overwhelmed by this, by all these objections and exceptions, that we didn't really know what to say. Well, Scott in his book helps you cut through a lot of that stuff by asking the simple question, what is the unborn? Because if the unborn is an innocent human being with all the rights of a human being made in the image of God anywhere else, then none of those justifications matter. You cannot intentionally kill an innocent human being. And he uses the acronym SLED, which is extremely helpful. I think he was actually the one who came up with that. Is that right?
No, he wasn't. But it is really helpful. It
stands for
in
size.
fact, it'll be part of that course,
Right,
part of the short course.
Okay, it stands for size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. So you go through those 4 criteria. Those are the differences between an unborn person and a born person. So they're smaller size. They are less developed than an adult. Just like an adult is more developed than a teenager, and a teenager is more developed than a newborn, and so on and so forth. That's not a relevant difference. That doesn't allow you to kill them. Environment. Well, just because I'm here versus there, just because I'm in the womb versus out of the womb, doesn't mean you get to kill me. And then degree of dependency. People will often say, in fact, this is Judith Jarvis Thompson's argument, in essence, and she's a pro-choice philosopher against the pro-life position. And she says that, well, the fetus depends on the mother for life. Therefore, the mother can expel the fetus because it's an interloper on her right to bodily autonomy. And the response to that is simply that, well, a newborn also requires his or her mother's body to survive because she's feeding that child. It doesn't mean you can just take the child away. A 5-year-old depends on their parents in order to survive, because the parents have to provide all the resources and time necessary to raise a child. So that degree of dependency also doesn't justify taking an unborn life. And that's the kind of argument that you can make with this book. It's just a fantastic resource. There's nothing I'd recommend more for helping pro-lifers learn how to make that case succinctly and powerfully, and avoid being confused by all the all the objections and justifications that get thrown out.
Well, you mentioned Scott's going to lead a short course. We actually called an audible on this and swapped him in because of the importance after the June Medical Services decision in the Supreme Court just reinforced again that what happens at the local and state level when it comes to life is going to be more important right now than what's happening at the Supreme Court. We certainly want Roe v. Wade to be overturned. We want to get rid of that legacy in the same way that we want to get rid of the Dred Scott legacy in the Supreme Court. At the same time, the way to go forward there is going to be to advance local arguments. One of the one of the things we didn't get to today, Shane, was the importance of this new Notre Dame study. I had a breakpoint this past week on what that can tell us about the current state of the abortion argument. And one of the key things is that the majority of Americans want abortion, don't like abortion, but they don't want to really make any more legal restrictions. And that seems contradictory because, it's contradictory. And Colorado, for example, has a ballot initiative for this election. And we are one of 9 states left that have late-term abortion. We have a late-term abortionist in Boulder who kills 200 late-term babies a year. He sees himself in the same kind of tradition as George Tiller and Willie Parker and some of these others. And, right now, most Coloradans themselves would not want abortion. But at the same time, there seems to be this high reticence against actually changing the law. And so our ability to make this case, our ability to talk about this as if it's more than a matter of private personal choice or preference, that we're actually dealing with absolutes, not, preferences, is really important. By the way, that's what the short course is going to do. It's going to engage people in the pro-life movement. I've never known anyone, by the way, Shane, I know you read his book. We used to have him to come speak when I worked at Summit, and he would speak on day 1 of the conference. And on day 14, when kids were going home, they would have a pro-life conversation on the airplane with the guy beside them. In other words, that was the usability of his training. And now he's trained, tens of thousands of people. And so I just asked him, Scott, we need to activate, our folks. We want a 4-week session. So session 1 is how to make that case in less than a minute for life. The second session is going to be the wrong ways we talk about abortion. Session 3 is going to be answering common objections to abortion. And session 4 is going to be the next thing you need to do to get started in the pro-life movement. So we're hoping to see, another 1,000 people join this cause, very soon. My recommendation this week, is prayer. I know that's kind of silly. I've been thinking about this since we said this last week. We talk about, well, other than praying, what can I do? We get that question all the time. And sometimes I think that, well, yeah, I'm supposed to pray, but what else can I do to help Nigerian Christians? Or what else can I do to stand for life? And a prayer is doing something, and it is doing something important. I was reminded about this again this past week when I was interviewing Stephen Anata, who runs the International Conference on Nigeria. They have published a report and a calendar that is documenting the scope and scale of the atrocities against Christians in Nigeria, first at the hands of Boko Haram and then the Fulani militants. It's overwhelming. And so I said, what can Americans do? And, he just said, you need to pray. And prayer, he went into it like prayer works. Prayer changes things. We believe in prayer. We're praying. And as a Nigerian, he's praying for persecuted Christians in other countries in the world because prayer moves things. That's why we're doing between now and the day after the election, a weekly prayer gathering. That's been so meaningful. Midweek, Wednesday mornings, 10:30 Eastern. Folks can join. Come to breakpoint.org. We'll tell you how to do it. Rick Warren led us in prayer the first week. Oz Guinness the second week. This coming week, it's Garland Hunt, a longtime friend of the Colson Center and Prison Fellowships, pastor in Atlanta, and just a courageous spokesperson for the Lord and for religious liberty, in particular in the state of Georgia. We need to do this. We talked earlier, Shane, about all the chaos that we know we're headed for in our country, particularly in light of the election. Well, let's pray. Let's not just talk about praying. Let's do it. Let's just not talk about repenting. Let's actually do it. And those times have been really, really meaningful. If you can join us, join us. If you can't, pray yourself. If you can't, get the video so you can pray along with us just at a different time. But I know that's a kind of a no-duh, recommendation, but that's what I got this week.
We're going to get atheists who are trolling us on the comment section for saying, well, Christians, you're not doing anything. You're just sending thoughts and prayers. And first of all, I object to that because I don't send thoughts. I don't know what it means to send thoughts. I've never done that in my life.
That's a new agey thing to do.
It's very new
happy
agey,
thoughts into the universe.
Right. I definitely send prayers. and up to the Almighty, who has all resources and all power at his disposal and can move things, and who uses prayer, we're promised, to bring about his will in the world. So yeah, I mean, that's prayer does so much for us, John. And it's not just that God uses it to bring about his will in the world. It's that prayer changes us as well. Because when we pray, we align ourselves with God. We make ourselves, vulnerable to his will, to his working. We remind ourselves that we don't ultimately have the power and that he moves everything. And I think we prepare ourselves to submit to his will, even when it runs contrary to our desires. And the ultimate example of that I always go back to is Christ himself, who is the perfect man, who never did anything wrong, who never prayed a silly prayer, and yet he prayed for things that he desperately desired, and that God said ultimately, no, I have a better plan, and it's going to involve you suffering and going through a hard time, but ultimately you become king of the universe in a whole new way, through the cross and resurrection. So yeah, I can't endorse that enough, and I can't rebuff the silliness of the atheists enough, who are going to inevitably troll us as if we're doing nothing. Well, thanks so much for listening to Breakpoint this week, folks. Come to breakpoint.org for links to all the resources that John and I have mentioned today on the program, including that great short course on Making the Case for Life with Scott Klusendorf. I can't recommend his work or his apologetics on this issue enough. It's just fantastic. So check it out. For John Stonestreet and for the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. We'll see you next time.